Going.
Okay, Brian, you said I'll just permission.
Hi, folks.
Hey,
Hi, Brian. We were looking at the church indestructible and looking at things specifically that war against the indestructible church. And last week we discussed the aspect of a lack of Bible knowledge, which in the church today is so lacking. I mean, and we discussed it whether fully last time. But as you know, Bible knowledge among members of the church today is very lacking. Another area that is warring against the church is that of worldliness. If you look at the church today, it is just filled with worldliness. Jesus talked about it actually in Matthew 13 and verse 22 in the parable of the sower, that he that receives seed among the thorns is he that heareth the word, and the care of the world, the deceitfulness of riches choke the word, and he becometh unfruitful. That is what has happened to a great extent within the church. We have allowed the world to overwhelm us in relationship to spiritual matters.
Michael, don't those two go hand in hand, or is that you're coming to that? Lack of knowledge and worldliness, don't they go hand in hand?
To a certain extent, I would say yes, necessarily.
No.
Someone can have Bible knowledge and yet still be so overwhelmed with this world that he doesn't do what he's supposed to do from a spiritual standpoint. I think that is very possible, but generally the worldliness is going to be going hand in hand with a lack of Bible knowledge. That's true. But I don't think always that's the case. But let's face it, well, let me mention one other thing, passage, Titus 2 and verse 11 and 12. 11 talks about, here's the grace of God that bringeth salvation, hath appeared to all men. And then it tells us that grace of God teaches us that we are to deny certain things, we are to live a certain way, and we are to look a certain way. That goes down into verse 13. We are to deny ungodliness and worldly lust. We are to live soberly, righteously, and godly in this present world, and then we are to look for that blessed hope and glorious appearing of our great God and Savior Jesus Christ. So there's the three things that the grace of God teaches us. But in that first one, we are to deny ungodliness, worldly lust. The idea of worldly lust there is what we refer to as worldliness. I think we all know that to a great extent this world is choking us as far as time is concerned. We are so involved with so many things running here and there and everywhere else that people just no longer have time for God. And I put quotes around that idea of having time for God because you make time for those things that you believe are important. But the situation from a realistic standpoint within the church today and with so many members is that the things of this world simply choke out the spiritual matters. And both of them cannot coexist. James 4 and verse 4 says, ye adulterers and adulteresses, know ye not that friendship with the world is enmity with God? Whosoever therefore will be the friend of the world is the enemy. And so this certainly attacks the indestructible church. When we allow worldliness to come into the church, then we we're a natural aspect to be destroyed. Another aspect in regards to that, and closely akin to it, would be that how many times do congregations today overlook things just for the sake of numbers and money? That's nothing but worldliness, that they are taking a worldly view of the church instead of a spiritual view of it. Spiritual view does not concern itself with money and numbers. It concerns itself with truth. And if the truth brings in great numbers, then fine. If the truth drives away great numbers, well, then that's what we've got to stay with anyway. Great illustration of that is John the 6th chapter. Jesus teaches some hard teachings in relationship to following him and being pleasing to God, and the multitude left. And Jesus turns to his apostles and asks them, "Are you going to leave also?" And of course Peter responds, "To whom shall we go? Thou hast the words of eternal life." And so Jesus did not, though, run after the numbers for the number's sake. And yet that's exactly what a lot of our brethren would have the church do today. Overlook, error concerning MDR, marriage, divorce, and remarriage today. Why? Because it might drive some away. Don't teach about social drinking today, because a lot of our brethren want to drink with their friends, neighbors, or they come home from a hard day of work and they have to have this adult beverage, beer or wine or whatever it might be, or they want a glass of wine with their meals and such. And so we don't teach about social drinking, and it's neither social, but that's another matter. We overlook that for the sake of numbers and for the sake of money. What it boils down to. And we could, there's a lot of things along that line that we could talk about in relationship to the church, very simply not teaching on certain subjects for the express purpose of retaining people and retaining numbers, having big numbers and having a big contribution. And let's face it, a lot of times that's very simply because they've got bills to pay. They've got a big building that they bought, and they have a large note that they're paying off, and they've got to have those numbers coming in and that money coming in so that they can pay their bills. And so don't preach on those things. Overlook those sins. But we need to learn spirituality always comes first. In 1 John 2, verse 15 through 17, John says to love not the world, neither the things that are in the world. Well, that's worldliness. If a man love the world, the love of the Father is not in him. For all that is in the world, the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, the pride of life is not of the Father, but is of the world, and the world passeth away in the lust thereof. But he that doeth the will of God abideth forever. If you look at the situation in the church today, both so many members of the church and so many congregations today have a love for the world, a love for God, first and foremost. And so they allow that worldliness in, and instead of the church demanding purity in its members, the church overlooks the sins in its members. Paul told, and I didn't realize this is to the individual in relationship to Timothy, but it has application to every Christian today to be an example of the believers in word and conversation and charity and spirit and faith and purity. 1 Timothy 4 and verse 12.
That sounds like a sermon outline, Michael.
That's a pretty good sermon outline, maybe even 2 or 3 sermons. Actually, the way in which I would approach it, he says to be an example. You are an example, but what type of example you are, he demands that we be examples of the believers, not an example of unbelievers, not of an example of people in the world. We're to be example of believers in 2 word and in conversation, of course, conversation, manner of life. And then the next 4 things, in charity and spirit and faith and in purity, would be how those 2 actions of are to be carried out. So that's the way in which I would approach that, and probably make it into more than 1 sermon, but that's me. But we are to be example of believers. Yet so many times when we allow sin to enter in among us and we don't do anything about the sin, then how is the church being an example of believers? It's not. It then is being an example to a world of worldliness, that there's no difference in reality between the Christian and that one who's not a Christian. And there is to be a difference. We are to come out from among them and be separate, is what Paul told the Corinthians, 2 Corinthians 6 and verse 17. And yet, so many times, we want to be just like the world. Well, that's worldliness. Paul told Timothy to lay hands suddenly on no man, neither be partaker of other men's sins, keep thyself pure. Now that's stated in relationship to when he says lay hands suddenly on no man, that's in relationship to the eldership. That those who are elders, you're not to make them elders suddenly in a quick way. You're to make sure that they are right and that they are what they should be. Neither be partakers of other men's sins. And yet, how many times do we in the church partake of sins of the world? And then the statement, keep thyself pure. The church is to be seeking purity and demanding purity of its members. And so many times we're not doing that anymore. We're not demanding that our members live pure lives, live the type of life that exemplifies Christianity and all that Christianity involves. And so as a result, there's no distinction. And we have allowed worldliness to come into the church. And thus that certainly does fight against the indestructible nature of the church. Once sin, there's the old statement, you can put a boat in water. As long as the water stays outside of the boat, you're doing fine. But once the water gets inside the boat, you've got some problems then. Well, same thing with the church and the world. The church is in the world, but it's not to allow the world to get into the church. When the world starts getting into the church, then we've got problems. And that's really what we've got in the Church of our Lord today to a great extent. We are not demanding that members of the church remain pure and holy and live upright lives. We see our members dressing like the world. In fact, so many times, you want to be fashionable. That is, you want to look like the people in the world. Doesn't matter whether it's godliness or not, and it doesn't matter if the dress is exemplifying what God wants us to be dressing as, and dressing, yes, in a modest way. We want to be fashionable. We want to look like the world. But it's going to be, purity is going to be exemplified in how we dress. Purity is going to be exemplified in how we speak. How many times do we hear Christians basically talking like the world, using the same language that the world uses? And many times what I'm talking about specifically, they use the crude language that the world uses. We wouldn't take the name of the Lord's name in vain, but we would use crude language. Well, if the crude, the immoral language is all right, then there's really no difference between us and the world. Christian speech is to be above reproach, and using improper language. And if you look at a lot of the passages that talk about our speech, it's not talking about, especially in the New Testament, it's not talking specifically about taking the Lord's name in vain. Now, I know we're not supposed to do that, but it's dealing more with the standpoint, let your speech be always with grace, seasoned with salt. And if you look at Ephesians, a lot of the aspects there, let all bitterness, wrath, anger, clamor, evil speaking be put away from you. And they're just a lot of phrases that we're not to allow corrupt communication to proceed out of our mouths. Those are the type of things that the scriptures talk about. And yet how many times do we allow corrupt, impure language to come out? That's as much of a problem among Christians as much more so than many times taking the Lord's name in vain. And should we even get into the aspect of euphemisms for the name of God? And I don't know about over in England, but here in the United States, one of the most common phrases you hear today is, "Oh my God," in relationship to everything. And the euphemism or a shortened phrase of it is OMG. Just using a shortened phrase to say exactly the same thing. Well, that's taking God's name in vain. But when you use a euphemism for God, golly, I can't even
Gosh.
say gee whiz, golly, and all terms, it's just saying the name, but it means exactly the same thing. We should not use God's name in a light or a frivolous way, and yet so many do. And so purity is going to demonstrate itself in the way in which we dress, the way in which we speak, and then, of course, in the way in which we act. Our actions are to be pure in relationship to being holy and godly within our living. And so keep yourselves pure. That's Paul's admonition to, yes, Timothy, but also to those who are Christians. We are to be pure in our life, in
Michael,
every aspect of our life. Yeah, Johnny.
I would say that what you are alluding to is that there is perhaps no preaching on that from the pulpits, and certainly no follow-up on that from leadership. It's not emphasized. I don't know what else is being preached, but certainly not on those particular things.
Well, to a great extent, as you probably know very well, that a lot of the preaching today, instead of preaching on things like into that, is preaching on how to be a good neighbor, how to handle your finances, how to be happy, and things like that, instead of preaching on purity. But that goes back to the worldliness that has crept into the church.
If we weren't on YouTube, I probably would have just thrown up.
Because you know that that's true, that so many congregations today, that is the emphasis.
You know, Michael, that years ago when I was in Northwest, I remember, I think I once preached or taught in a class, I can't remember which way it was, you know, concerning the use of some of the words that came out from Christians' mouth. I mean, that in a sense, like, you know, oh, you know, good luck is a good example of it. Well, Lady Luck has nothing to do with God. I mean, we live by providence, not by luck. And yet you still hear brethren praying that, dear God, you know, thank you that we have been so lucky so far that you have blessed us. And you know, it's a contradiction in terms. You can't be lucky and be blessed by God. I mean, you're either blessed or you're lucky. So and I've said it so many times, but it's just fallen on deaf ears. You know, another term that brethren like to use is, you know, oh my goodness. I mean, I say goodness is the nature of God. You don't attribute things like that so flippantly in your speech. Although you're not using God's name in vain, but goodness is something that is for God, and we should reverence and respect that His nature, and not come up, you know, and let it slip from our tongue.
A lot of brethren have simply failed to understand a lot of those things. But when you get to the word good and thus goodness, the basic etymology of that word is God ordained. Goodness is that which God has ordained, and living according to what God goodness. But that's the basic etymology of that word. Yes, Brian.
Actually, Sonny's forgotten. In fact, in the last 6 months here, he's already discussed these various words, and I was quite surprised because I didn't know all the words that actually he stated that Christians should not use, that are disrespectful and insulting to God. Actually, I think I unearthed his list just even in this last week or so. So it's an interesting thing, and I must admit, I'm afraid I've been guilty of using certain words that you've been using today that are not right for any Christian to use. Yes, I confess it, but I also wish to repent of it, you know.
Well, there's a lot of times and we always need to understand, sometimes people don't know, and they need to be informed. I've had, literally after preaching on these and using some of the words that are euphemisms for God or Jesus or spiritual things, come out and challenge me and saying, no, that's not the case. And I said, go look it up in the dictionary and see if it is. They came back and said, yes, you're right. They didn't know. A lot of times, like what you're talking about, Brian, we get into habits, and sometimes it's difficult and it takes time to break those habits.
Yeah, that's what it is. Oftentimes, that's what it is.
Yeah, and it does take time, and we need to realize that and work with people, and not be too hard on ourselves in that regard, yet continue to work on ourselves so that we don't do those things and say those words. But purity is going to be manifesting itself in the way in which we speak. That's just one of those areas of purity. And we are not to be like the world, and our speech is going to demonstrate that. When we are pure in all of those ways, by our speech, by our actions, by our clothing that we wear, we're going to be different from the world. We are not going to be like them, and they're going to be wondering about us because we're not like they are. We're not running, as Peter would put it, to the same excess of riot, and thus, yes, there's going to be persecution. They'll speak evil of you to the same excess of riot. You're not doing the same things they are. And so, but when we start doing the same things they are, we don't demand that purity, then it destroys the church.
That's right.
Michael, would you say, or would you think that, and we've talked about this in a separate study, that giving is tied into this in some way?
I think giving,
if you're giving as if we're
point
giving
of treasure
as,
that we ought be also.
if we're giving as we ought, then that will be a very definite indicator of whether we're putting God first.
I believe it does. I don't think there's any way around it. When you are thinking spiritually and your interest is spiritual matters first, that's where your money's going to go. If your money is going elsewhere, then that's where your interests are going to be. That's, I hate to even bring this up, but in raising children, when they are given everything, they don't have any respect for it because they don't have anything vested in it. It's been given to them. It's not worth anything. If they have to go out on their own and buy it, that's a different matter. They start learning to take care of it then, because there's an interest there. That's where their money is going into. Now then they've got to take care of it. They've got an interest into it. Same thing from the spiritual standpoint. When we put our money into the church and into the work of the church, then our interest is going to go there. And then the purity that God demands can be shown through. So yes, I think money is tied into it.
I mean, I was the reason I was asking because I was thinking that if you start from there, then everything else, rolls out from that. And when you have people objecting to that, that's a clear indicator that they're objecting to everything else that follows.
And that's true, but there's probably a lot of other things that you can also start with.
Well, yes.
And that's maybe the problem of saying, it starts here. Well, it starts a lot of places. It depends on the person. Mm-hmm. I've seen, and you probably know of situations as well, where an individual will think, I can give all this money, and then I don't have to do anything. Mm-hmm. Have you ever run across that? I have.
I'm sure I have. Well, in my experience, most of the people who are good givers are really involved in some way. I've not run across I've not run across people who are really good givers who are not involved, who are otherwise engaged in something else.
See, I have. I know of situations where people are really good givers, but if you try and get them to be spiritual, you can forget it. And really what it is, that's the type of individual that's trying to buy their way into heaven.
Catholic.
Yes, I came across myself personally in the previous the previous two congregations where I came from, isn't it? That where we used to have this, kind of a request to brethren to volunteer to clean the church building once a week, or once a month, and nobody volunteered. And I remember that we raised the issues with the ladies, and the ladies said, well, I ain't gonna come to church on a Sunday in my nice Sunday dress and clean the building. we can pay somebody to clean the building. you know,
Mm-hmm.
oh, that's very interesting. You throw money to a problem instead of being of service to God. It's very sad reflection. It's a very sad reflection of the state of mind of some of the brethren.
I think it was last year. We've been to a few places. We were to a few places where we've seen the children taught to do the cleaning in the building before and after services. It's kind of, sort of from the beginning they started to learn a little early to respect the building rather than running around and climbing all over everything. And
might be a good idea for more to do that. But I've seen the same thing that Sonny's been talking about, or talked about, where yes, we'll pay someone to do it, but we don't want to do it. And so, but all of those things, that's that attitude of worldliness. And that attitude gets back, a lot of times you start seeing that then we're going to pay someone to evangelize for us. We're going to pay someone to take care of our kids for us. We're going to pay someone to do this or pay someone to do that instead of taking personal responsibility. That becomes a sad situation with a lot of congregations or a lot of individuals as well. I mentioned one other thing, and then in regards to war against the indestructible church, and that is when we slow down or stop our opposition to error. And I know that we could talk a great deal about this, but of course we know that we are to contend earnestly for the faith which was once for all delivered unto the saints, Jude 3. We are to fight. We enter into Christianity and we put on the armor of God. Well, we don't put on the armor of God in order to sit down and take our ease. We put on God's armor in order to enter into a combat, into a fight.
Michael, let me stop you there a second. We have decided in San Mateo we're not going to discuss that verse anymore. We've taken out the pews and we brought in nice black leather sofas. We have people come in now that bring lemonade and peel grapes, and we don't want people to be upset and feel that they have a responsibility to defend the truth. We want everybody to be happy and comfortable and complacent, and we're just going to take a nice smooth ride to what we hope is heaven.
And that road leads directly to hell instead, as you know. I know that you're saying all that tongue-in-cheek. And I'm saying that just for someone who might watch at some other time who might not know. So
yes.
I know you're saying that.
You can't be serious.
Call him Curly.
But that is,
the other thing,
in reality, that is the attitude of a lot of congregations. That is exactly what they've done. They're not going to oppose error anymore. They're not going to fight against false doctrine. And if you do, then we don't want anything to do with you. That's the attitude of a lot of congregations. We are to, and I was actually going to get to a lot of that Johnny was talking about in a minute, but we have an obligation to have not only no fellowship with the unfruitful works of darkness, Ephesians 5:11. A lot of brethren want to stop there, and they will be accepting of that aspect. But then when it says, but rather reprove them,
expose them. Mm-hmm.
Expose, reprove, it would be the idea of rebuking them. They want nothing to do with that aspect of Christianity. They'll stay away from the evil, but I don't want to say anything to expose them or rebuke them, the evil.
Or even name names.
Or naming names, that's true.
I think does Paul have, Paul, were you going to say something?
Yeah, I was going to say, I mean, another thing that seems to be happening now is people who should be challenging these things are using the excuse of harassment. So they're saying, oh, we can't keep on at them because they'll say that we're harassing them. You know, and you know, it seems to come across as a very good excuse for not doing these things. You know, because that's where the law comes in.
Oh, that's a cultural, a world, well, at least a cultural trend, even in the United States. If you are critical of something, then you're a hater. You're harassing. You're you know, anything, just about anything.
I guess you could say that Jesus harassed the scribes and Pharisees.
Oh, he would have been, he would have been taken off the streets, no doubt.
Or Paul when he harassed Hymenaeus and Philetus, or Alexander the coppersmith.
He was a bigot.
He was, yeah, you could accuse him of all types of those type of things. But really he was doing what is required of Christianity. He was reproving those people and those doctrines.
Well, Michael, a lot of people don't.
Proverbs 25 and verse 9. We're
a lot
told.
A lot of people don't see it in the way that it actually is, and that is, it's either God's way or it's the way of evil.
You broke up about halfway through on mine.
I said people don't realize that it's God's way and not their way, and if they don't want to hear it, you know, if it's what the Bible is teaching on a particular subject about their sin or about what they should do, people don't want to hear it. Then the description, usually hurled at you personally, is that you're biased, unloving, insensitive. I mean, it's the same sort of thing that we see in the description of people who are opposed to illegal immigration, or you know, all of these types of things. We see not that people don't know what the law is. The law has become immaterial. It no longer matters. We want things from our emotive response.
Yeah, that's really what happens with a lot of people nowadays. It's more emotion than what God says. Or
well, like the person who came and told you were wrong about that word study, that euphemism. I mean, rather than saying something like, well, Michael, I never knew that. I'm going to have to go look that up. No, first they attack you and say you're wrong, and then they go look to see whether or not you're right. I mean, fortunately, the person was big enough a person to come back and say you were right, which many people won't do. But the initial response was you're wrong.
Yeah. Well, at least he didn't accuse Michael of saying it, putting it in a very harsh tone, isn't it? It's the way you say it, Michael.
That's true. With a lot of people, it is more the tone of voice or something along that line instead of what is said, the content. But that's the attitude of a lot of people. We today, basically, Proverbs 25 and verse 9 says, debate thy cause with thy neighbor and discover not a secret to another. But you talk about debate now. No, that's ungodly. In Philippians 1:17, Paul says, I am set for the defense of the gospel. That's what we're to be. I remember when Tom Warren debated first Anthony Flew and then others, but after the Flew debate, he had members of the church attacking him for debating. That basically that was and should not debate. Well, we're to hate the evil and love the good, as Amos 5:15 says, and yet a lot of people in the end result of it, they love the evil and hate the good. And so they won't really oppose the evil.
In Acts 17, rather than being with Paul, they probably would have been shopping in the marketplace.
That's true. They would have been. You know, when we stop our opposition to evil, or we slow it down, what happens is that we come across these ideas. Well, you just look for the good in people, and be positive all the time. Don't worry about the evil. In fact, some would say if you start worrying about error and about sin and those things, you might become paranoid.
But those things are unrelenting, Michael. Sin is unrelenting.
Sure.
And that liberal idea is one that constantly has to be opposed, because they're not going to stop. And even when it's proven to be wrong, it will continue to. I think that's been the one of the problems, is that sin has worn so many brethren down, and they're just tired. And some, of course, don't want to do it anyway, and they themselves are worldly. But the idea of continuing to battle and contend for the faith, the idea of stopping the mouths, and I mean, those kinds of things are just uncomfortable, and they don't recognize that the end result is far worse than they can imagine. It's like people who some initially may have been, they don't want to hate, they don't want to oppose same-sex marriage, not having a clue as to what the ulterior motives and the ramifications of that will be.
And you mentioned this at first, is that we get worn down in our opposition. We start fighting, and we win some battles, and then they come back and they fight again in another way. And we just, after a while, get tired of fighting. And so
Matthew 4.
Yeah, that's a good illustration that Satan keeps coming back, and keeps coming back in a different way. Satan is a roaring lion. He's out there trying to devour us. And if he can't devour us the first time, then he's going to come back around and try and do it again. Doing it for our entire life. And we're in a battle for our entire lifetime thus. But we get tired. I mean, it's difficult to constantly oppose and to be in a fight all of the time. And so Satan knows that, and he starts working on us, and over time we just start getting tired and giving in. And that's something that happens when, well, Satan's won. When we stop our opposition to error, Satan has won. That's an attack and way in which he wars against the indestructible church.
Well, we need to get more cantankerous preachers and elders.
Well, we probably do, yes. Maybe a better word, unrelenting. That's what we have to be in our opposition to error. But you hear the idea, and this is presented in Isaiah 30 and verse 10, people saying to the seers, see not, and to the prophets, prophesy not unto us right things, but speak unto us smooth things, prophesy deceits. And then Paul, of course, 2 Timothy 4 and verse 3, after he tells us, preach the word, be instant in season, out of season, reprove, rebuke, exhort. Why? Well, the time is coming when they will not endure sound doctrine, but after their own lust shall they heap to themselves teachers, having itching ears. They have itching ears. They want to be tickled. They want to be made to feel good. And so they're going to find a preacher out there who will preach peace, peace. And in reality, there is no peace. But yet, there's going to be those individuals who are sitting there scratching the ears of the members instead of warring against error and against sin. And the people are just going to love to have it. So, those type of things, when we stop our opposition to error, stop opposing it, then that wars against the indestructible church. And if we allow it to, if we don't continue to oppose evil, then the evil will come in and overtake the church, and it will no longer be the church for which Christ died, and thus it will be destroyed.
Well, that is what Paul said to the elders from Ephesus, where he said, what, for 3 years did I not warn you night and day with tears?
And so they need to watch for themselves and the flock, because there's going to be men, even among themselves, who are going to come in speaking perverse things to draw away disciples after them. If they do not continue to fight, then that's going to be the result. People will come in and destroy the church. Well, next week, what I plan to get into then is the church and self-discipline, and discuss that a little bit. But if there's nothing else on this and on the indestructible church, while we know that the church cannot be destroyed, yet the church here upon this earth and congregations can be, if we do not keep the church pure, if we don't continue to fight against error, if we don't have and instill in people Bible knowledge, then we will be destroyed as a congregation and as a people of God. The church, of course, though, is indestructible because it's built upon that indestructible Christ and His Word, and that will not be destroyed. So unless there's